Sony has been kicking butt and snapping pics all over the place, and they just ran out of room on their SD card. This camera might be the most disruptive camera they have yet produced, not only to their competitors, but to themselves as well. This is the brand new ZV-E1. So it's part of their ZV lineup, but it is an interchangeable lens, and it's full frame. Buddy, full frame, interchangeable lens, budget lineup. This changes everything. And the best thing about it is it has the same sensor as some of their $6,000 cameras. Oh buddy, let's go. Let's finish this unboxing. This is clearly not final packaging, but it might give you an idea what will be in the box. This is the version that comes with the kit lens, 28 to 60, versatile little lens. It's not gonna win any awards, but it's nice when you have an option when you're spending all your money on a camera. Other than that, strap, charger and cable. This looks like it's like a 2.0 cable, so I'm guessing you're not doing any data transfers on this, just power. Sony has learned a lot and is not doing the typical Sony thing that they've done in the past where, new camera, new batteries, new formats, new things. This camera is gonna work with the same batteries you use in most of the Alpha lineup. So, the A7 IV, A7 R5, A7 S3, and the FX3, which, based on the specs and the little experience I have, might have fewer and fewer reasons to be bought when we look more deeply at this thing. Last thing in the box is just a little windsock. Built into this camera, there's a 3 microphone array. And you can slide it into the hot shoe mount this way, and it'll provide a little bit of wind protection, as well as, give your camera a little haircut. That's cute. It's like a troll doll. Let's take a closer look at the body of the camera. First thing first, it's noticeably smaller than other Alpha cameras, but it is quite a bit larger than the ZV-E10, which is very similar in a lot of ways, but it is a APS-C sensor. I like the way this feels. It feels comfortable in the hand. I find mirrorless cameras in general always a little bit small. When I squeeze the grip, my fingers kind of press against the body, not the grip. But in my experience over the weekend, I never felt like I was gonna launch this away in the same way when I'm holding, point and shoot or a smaller one. This is kind of uncomfortable to hold for long periods of time, but also feels like it's gonna slip out of my hand at any point. One of the first things I notice when I look at the ZV-E1 is the dire lack of controls. On a professional camera, you want dials, knobs, buttons, everything everywhere so that with one button press, you're in complete control of whatever setting you want. But that is not the target market of the ZV-E1. This is a camera built from the ground up for vloggers. On the top, we have our power slider, zoom toggle. We have our shutter button for the photo mode, which we will get to later. We have custom functions 1 and 2. 2 is for focus magnification. 1, I believe, is set for some of these AI processed super modes that are gonna steal my job. Boo, get out of here, you stupid smart camera. I need dumb cameras for dumb camera operators like me. Then we have our record button. We have our toggle between the 3 different modes, which is a lot less than, something like an A7 Mark IV or an A9 Mark II. On the top, we have our toggle for photo mode, which we will get into later. We have our video mode, which is definitely this camera's primary function, and then the slow and quick function for slow-mo and time lapses and whatnot. Besides that, we have our hot shoe mount, which in my opinion will be a very important port on this camera, as really, if you want to get good audio into this camera, this is your one option. Other than that, there's the internal mic, which is fine for certain applications, a 3.5mm jack in, so there's some accessories you can use there, but it's usually kind of not so great. And then we have our LED indicator. It turns red, it's a tally light, and we have our film plane indicator. If you don't know what that means, basically it just means that's where the sensor lines up. Just a neat little tidbit for you. If you want to keep this camera topped up while shooting, you'll need at least a 50-watt charger. You can use less than that, but it'll just slowly drain as you're using it. Here we have our single SD card slot. That's fine for most people. Most people aren't dual recording or shooting proxies because the danger of losing footage isn't that dire. And if I was using this as a vlog camera, I would consistently be backing up to a hard drive or my computer. So luckily the slot is SDXC2, UHS 1 and 2 compliant V90. You will need a fast card to get the most out of the high bit rates of this camera. In fact, you'll get very short recording times on a slower card. In the bottom, we have our micro HDMI and a headphone jack, for monitoring yourself. On the bottom, we have our quarter thread mount. It would be nice, to have two for a little bit of stability on a tripod plate, but at this size, I don't expect it. And then we have our FZ100 battery slot. Considering this camera is so small, it's quite a feat that they've managed to engineer using one of the bigger batteries. On the ZV-E10, we get the older model FWP50s. As you can see, there's a lot more capacity. And there's also more sophisticated battery chemistry in the newer ones as well. This is good because even though this is a more sophisticated camera with higher end features, having the bigger battery in the ZV-E1 is amazing because it can actually take more still photos and video on a single charge, even though this is a higher end camera with more features. On the back, I guess is also kind of the top, is control wheel. This is, I guess, our primary one. We'll explore, the ways you can assign functions to it. We have our menu button, back to custom 2 or focus magnification. We have the function button, and it's pre-programmed to work with the smartphone app. And then we have, our back control wheel with center button and all its various functions, our playback and our delete. All typical camera stuff. Overall, for a vlogging camera that is primarily used by someone who isn't interested in fine controls over the camera, this is fine. But for someone like me, who's looking to possibly replace an A7S III or an FX3 with something cheaper, but potentially as good a video, it's a little bit of a letdown. Thankfully, Sony has implemented a better UI than the ZV-E10, which we'll explore, and a touchscreen control. So yes, we have all these buttons, but hey, we got the best button of all, a touchscreen. It's got the same level of manipulation as a lot of their other cameras. You can spin it around, so when you're shooting vlog, you can point it at yourself. There's a few things I like about where things are placed. I like actually having the SD card on the left side of the camera, your right, because this is a camera I imagine living on a gimbal a lot, and so you have your gimbal arm here, and a lot of the time you're trying to switch cards, but you can't. You have to take the whole camera off just to switch your card on this side. Luckily, hey, you can reach it on the other side. You still will have trouble with the battery because the battery's on this side. So I think that's a nice little quality of life feature that I don't know if it was on purpose or just by happenstance by having to, fit everything into this camera. And then my final little complaint, and this is across pretty much all alpha cameras as well, is having the HDMI on the same side that the camera flips out onto. And so if you're streaming with this camera and you're using the screen as a little monitor, it's gonna be at least partially obfuscated by the cable blocking it. Luckily, it's been moved down lower on the body, so it's not as big of a deal. One of the huge features of this camera is that the USB can actually do 4K 30. Even though a lot of alpha cameras are capable of 4K 30, 4K 60, through the USB port, they've often been limited just by data transfer rates. This one is, according to them, the first one that can actually do 4K 30 properly. It also has an HDMI output, but it's not quite as high bit rate as the Cinema line that can do 16-bit RAW. Finally, and most importantly, is the sensor. The thing that's most exciting is that the sensor that's in the FX3, in the FX6, in the A7S II is the same sensor, full frame everything, backlit, Bions XR, that's in this, and this camera actually has more modern processing. It's got AI supplementing some of its stabilization and its tracking. And so even though the alpha cameras have been top tier in autofocus, this bad boy could be even better. I can't wait to explore what this bad boy can do, but not before I tell you about our sponsor, woohoo! NexiGo. If you're working from home and are in need of a new webcam, NexiGo has a wide variety to choose from to keep you looking sharp on conference calls. Whether you're on a budget and need high quality video, or you want the best possible webcam regardless of price, their selection of webcams and webcam accessories will help you look and sound your best. Even if you're looking for something more in the middle, NexiGo has got you covered. Take your webcam setup to the next level and get a NexiGo webcam at the link below. The touchscreen on this camera is actually decently usable. I think the gold standards in terms of touchscreen interface is still the Blackmagic Ursa. Not even the most current ones, the older ones that had the bigger screen, where anything you need on the camera, you just touch it and then you manipulate it, you change it. Full disclosure, I took this camera out on the weekend and shot some video. The camera's asking me if I want to set the tolerance for higher temperatures up higher. That's reminding me of one of the big shortcomings of this camera, due to the fact that they've compressed almost everything that goes into this bigger camera into a smaller frame. There's effectively not a heat sink or a way for heat that the camera is creating to escape. And the record times at the higher bitrate on this camera are quite reduced. I've actually did some testing, so I'll just read what I experienced. The numbers that Sony give are comparing the FX3 to the ZV-E1, and they say that at 150 megabits 60p 4K on the FX3, you get about 90 minutes of recording, and on the ZV-E1, that's 30 minutes. And you might say, hey, that's still a lot of time. I'm shooting my vlogs, I'm shooting shots here. Yes, but there is definitely use cases where you need a camera rolling longer, you're shooting an interview as a B cam, or you're doing weddings, and even though it's not continuous recording, the heat is still going up, and so you'll just come up against walls, especially when you consider that 150 megabit mode is only a quarter of its highest megabit on offer. This camera can do up to 600 megabit at 60p, and on my testing, that gave me about 15 minutes of recording, and then I let it cool off for a little bit and then tried it again, and I got about 2 minutes of recording, and I went back again and got about 30 seconds of recording. Your use may vary. This was inside, around 20 degrees Celsius, but 15 minutes at your highest bitrate could definitely be a bottleneck that you will come up against. And if long recordings is something that's essential to you, that's a huge consideration for moving up to the FX3. Oh, they're like really going for iPhone measurements. It's a gesture-based UI, which is interesting. Once we have the camera and the phone connected and we've gotten through all the initiation. Once you've gotten past all the startup steps, and you've connected your phone and stuff, you'll be presented with a UI that should be very familiar to you if you've used any alpha cameras before. Part of their design philosophy was actually to transplant the UI of the Pro line cameras into this, which I think is a great thing. The ZV-E1 menu was kind of confusing, and a lot of it's just familiarity, but in navigating this, I felt the categorization and the way things are lined up makes a lot more sense. By default, it's shooting HD. We're gonna set up to the high bitrate 4K, let's go. The bitrates are held behind different frame rates. So if you do want the highest bitrate, the 60 megabit mode, you're gonna have to go to 60p, but we shoot this video in 30p. And so we're gonna shoot in 30 just so it's a little easier to use. Like I said, the sensor is the same as the alpha lineup, and so you're getting a 422 readout, which is a slight compromise on color information. But I bet if you're considering buying this camera, you're shooting in 420 right now, you dirty dog, you. Outside of that, we have our slow motion and time-lapse settings. One thing that's really nice about this camera is that you can actually shoot in S-Log3 or Cinetone, which is a color profile designed to mimic Sony's Venice line of cameras. So hey, we're moving up from the alpha line all the way to the top to Venice, baby. You can even set using a cropped mode for video. So if you have APS-C lenses, or you just need a little extra throw, you can set that. And one thing that's really nice is there's actually lens compensation. So if you're using Sony first-party lenses, they can work together to mitigate lens breathing, which is as you focus, the size of objects changing, and also chromatic aberration at the edges of frames. We have our media control, so we can format, you can recover if you lost stuff. Hopefully that never happens to you. You can give it a naming convention on your camera. You have your different shoot modes, and this is where this camera could potentially surpass the FX3 and the FX6. Inside of this camera is Sony's most sophisticated AI processor yet. They've already had the top of the game in terms of autofocus, and we use the FX6 here, and I trust that autofocus with my life. But there's still shortcomings. It can track faces, it can identify certain objects, but when a person turns and it's the back of their head, it has issues. This has AI compensation for that and should do a better job. Same with tracking objects during stabilization. It's gonna use this AI to move the cropped frame on the sensor to track that subject better and adjust the image stabilization, the electronic image stabilization, even better. And let me tell you, the results are f***ing impressive. First, we have the intelligent auto, which is the full AI mode. It's gonna figure out what you're trying to shoot and the best ways to shoot it. It'll change everything in some pretty neat ways. And if you're someone that knows nothing about cameras, I think this will be a really appealing option. You have your program auto, which in a lot of run and gun situations is something that I've often used. Basically, you lock in some settings that you like, and then the camera will automatically compensate others in order to keep the exposure consistent. Kind of keeping in line with that, you have your aperture priority, where basically you set your aperture and then everything else compensates, and your shutter priority, where you set your shutter and then it compensates. And then you have the mode that I would use, which is manual exposure. As someone who has used cameras for many, many years and I'm comfortable, this is the mode I'm gonna want. But this is definitely not the mode Sony wants me to use. We have our shutter controls, and so you can set this, to silent mode, even though this is always gonna be silent mode. Basically, you're just turning off the beeper. One of the big downsides to this, when you compare it to the more hybrid-minded Sony cameras, is there is no mechanical shutter. there's a photo mode that has, you know, all these auto compensations, and it'll do in a pinch using the 12 megapixel sensor, which is fine for Instagram and Twitter and whatnot. But if you're planning on using this as a hybrid shooter, probably isn't sufficient. But not having a mechanical shutter actually does kind of impact, you know, your image quality, your dynamic range going down, and you can get more rolling shutter artifacts even in photos. That's fine. Really, this is a video camera with, you know, a mild picture shooting mode. You can use the same USB-C adapter that the FX3 uses to jam timecode in this camera. And then we get to the image stabilization, which is pretty darn neat. There's 4 options here. We have off, I mean, off is off. We have active and dynamic active, which will more aggressively crop and move the image on the sensor around to stabilize the image. I have a little bit of demo footage that you're seeing now. There's some lens settings you can give to help the camera out when you're not using Sony first-party lenses in terms of compensation and whatnot. Using both the kit lens and the slightly upgraded 24-105 that we do all our vlogs on, I was really impressed. When you combine the optical image stabilization of this lens with this camera, the results are so impressive. Gimbals are gonna start to go out of style. I was running around one-handing this thing, not even trying my best to use all my camera guy skills to hold it steady, and it is more than watchable. We have the zoom options. You can lock off digital zoom. I would highly recommend that, at least for the video modes, because there's not a whole lot of room on the sensor to go in. You can set up what's on your display as you go, your markers, and you have your different shooting modes. One of the big modes that Sony talks about is the cinematic vlog preset. If you're someone who wants full control and is gonna edit and apply LUTs and stuff after you shoot, this isn't ideal. But if you're just running and gunning and you want your footage, your short film to just look like a cinematic film, basically this applies color profiles, an anamorphic crop, and is intended to make your footage that you shoot as easily as possible look cinematic. Regular and cinematic. Ooh, yeah. To be fair, you'd be surprised what a big difference shooting an anamorphic does for changing the image to feel more cinematic. Not only does it force you to frame a little bit differently, but it's just like a cue in your head. Same with shooting in 24 frames. It's just like a little thing that'll happen in your brain where you're like, that's a cinematic image. Outside of that, we have all our exposure options, exposure compensation, how it's doing its metering, white balance, color tone display. You can import LUTs. We have our AI enhanced dynamic range optimizer, cool. We have our creative look. So you can set custom profiles in the camera in terms of, you know, saturation, contrast, sharpness, whatnot. You have the creative look, then you have your picture profiles that you can mess around with. Usually S-Log 3 is picture profile 8. I've done a reset and now there is no 7 through 9. I mean 7, 8, 9, am I right? I was shooting with the 709 preset just because I knew we weren't gonna have time to color correct. And so what you're seeing is mostly 709. I think I shot a little bit of log. We have our soft skin effect, which, you know, is just AI enhancing of skin. Generally, I'd keep that off, but if I was vlogging and, you know, I didn't have time to correct lighting and I just wanted to make sure my skin looked good, I might have that on. We have all our different autofocus settings. So generally, you're gonna want continuous autofocus. It's still gonna try and track your face and or your body. This is all pretty standard alpha stuff, which is really important. As I've used the more and more modern alpha lineup, I've relied more and more on the autofocus. Often, you know, you're just shooting, you're just touching the different subjects on the screen. Being able to change the autofocus transition speed is really, really important, especially if you're one-man shooting or, you know, vlogging. Having it be able to not just whip between the two subjects can be nice. It can create a more cinematic, soft feel. You can change the focus area. You can tell it to recognize certain subjects. There's, you know, focus peaking, and you can change those settings. Considering how limited the physical buttons on this camera are, having this level of control in the settings is absolutely a godsend. And this is a totally excellent UI for what this camera will be doing. I will note that this camera is already warm, and we've just been going through the menu. You'll notice that we're quite deep into this camera unboxing, and I haven't really talked about image quality or sensor quality. And like I said, this is the same sensor in this camera as exists in the FX3, the FX6, the A7S III, and that sensor produces images that are absolutely phenomenal. There's a reason Sony is kicking everyone's butt up and down the block. It's not just the autofocus, it's not the build quality, it's their sensor quality and the low light performance of these cameras. It's sometimes mind-boggling how good of an image you can get with just moonlight out of some of these cameras. By default, the ISO on this camera ranges from 80 to about 100,000 and is expandable up to just above 400,000. Obviously, it's gonna be grainy. At like 12,800 ISO, These things can pick up so much light and you have so much control. You can stop down your aperture even in really dark settings and get the exact image you want. What I've really enjoyed using Sony cameras is it's really easy to get exactly the image I want. What I was testing, one of the things I was testing on the weekend is if I was using this camera to shoot a vlog in my garage, I spend my free time, you know, modding consoles and doing stuff. So I just like pointed the camera at it, let the autofocus do its thing. How does that image look? Because I don't have very many lights in my garage. I don't have time to move and do the console stuff at the same time. So I wanna see how this camera can do. And when I looked at this footage, I was very pleased. Not only does it look as good as a $6,000 camera like the FX6, the AI controls that it's doing are thoroughly impressive. This is the kind of camera you can just use without really thinking about. As a camera operator whose livelihood depends on me proving that my skill set is worth it to my employer, this thing scares me. This thing is absolutely phenomenal. If you don't know what you're doing, you just set it on some of the auto modes. You might have to do the shot twice as it figures out what's happening out, but the Sony cameras are essentially running themselves now. It's a little scary, man. I thought AI was gonna take all the labor jobs first. It's coming for creative jobs. I will work for Bitcoin. Going back to the main interface, something I really like about this camera is if I wanna change the ISO, I just hit the ISO and I can switch it around. Same with the f-stop or shutter speed. Same with white balance. This is a very intuitive way to do it. Sometimes, especially if you're someone that doesn't use cameras often, it's just so much easier to touch the thing you're trying to change and change it. I think this is a great UI, and even though the touchscreen's a little bit small, I appreciate that level of control. If you're shooting vlogs, you know, you might have a bunch of needs for video. This can do 4K from 24 to 120 with a future firmware upgrade. Currently it's just 24 to 60, or 1080p from 24 to 240. 240 is a pretty darn good slow-mo mode, especially if you're doing, you know, action, you're not trying to do a scientific kind of test. I did some testing with the rolling shutter, and they have the same processing that's in the A7S III or the FX3, and even though it's a full frame sensor, the jello wasn't too bad until I'm really whipping the camera around. Quite impressive for what, you know, is an entry-level professional video camera. Another feature I really like is using the AI, like I talked about for tracking, where it's moving the image along the sensor to do a better job stabilizing, as well as LUTs, can all be recorded internally while you're sending an unprocessed version of what the camera is capturing to an HDMI. So you can do dual recording, one with what the camera processes and one that is untouched so you have more control later. I think that's a really cool feature and very nice. Also, just sometimes the AI processing might mess up and do some kind of catastrophic error that ruins your shot. Now you don't gotta worry about that. That being said, you still have to have an HDMI plugged in, so that limits, you know, gimbal stuff that you're doing. After all this exploration of the feature set of the ZV-E1, the question remains, should you spend your hard-earned money on this camera? Well, the first part of that equation is, how much does this cost? Sony hasn't given an official price. They said that it's gonna be somewhere between $2,200 and $2,400, and add on $300 to that price for the kit lens, which is not great, it's fine. And if you have no E lenses, sure. I would probably recommend going on the used market and getting one of those Tamron 28 to 70s. They're gonna serve you a little better. It's kind of a hard question. If you are a hybrid shooter and photos are part of your business or part of your hobby, no, this is not what you should buy. For about the same amount of money, for $2,500, you can get an A7 Mark IV, which, yes, it's quite a bit less good for video. It's still got 4K 30, some good bit rates, slightly worse rolling shutter, but it has a mechanical shutter and a bunch of photo features that will serve you much better. If you're a vlogger and you're just getting into it, $2,200 to $2,400 is a pretty big asking price for something to just get going. But if you're someone who's looking for a B cam to their Sony setup, when you consider that this camera is $6,000, this is $3,900, and this is just above half of that, this becomes pretty bonkers of a value proposition. Yes, there are shortcomings, you know, just the single SD card slot could be an issue. The overheating could be an issue depending on your workflow. But the fact that this is a full frame sensor that is as good as these much more expensive cameras, has high bitrate video, even better autofocus and AI processing than these. If you are a vlogger who's looking to step up their game, this is an absolutely phenomenal choice. When you go into the broader camera world, it starts to be a little bit harder to digest the price when you compare it to a Panasonic S5 II can do 6K video. It's got great image quality. I mean, if you've watched Bo Burnham's special of Inside, that's the S5 that's shot on. Problem with the Panasonics is that the autofocus isn't as good. So if you're doing, you're a video professional and you are gonna be doing manual focus, that might be a better option for you for a little less money. The lens options available for that camera are a little less comprehensive, but it's a little less money, and the S5 II has some extra little video features that might even push it over the edge. Canon also has their mirrorless line that they're constantly updating, like the R8, which is $1,500. Yes, its video modes are more limited. It doesn't have as good of a bit rate. If you're a hybrid shooter, it's got all those photo modes that might come in clutch. If you're a vlogger and you're just creating content for YouTube and you're not that worried about the look, the ZV-E10 is an amazing option, and it comes in at less than a third of the price at $700. It's still a compelling option with a lot of the same autofocus and AI assisted features. The sensor's a little bit smaller and the lens selection will be a little less high quality. But at the end of the day, you know what your budget is, and this is a very compelling option at $700. And so really, the ZV-E1 is an absolutely phenomenal camera if you are a video only professional who is shooting by themselves and who wants autofocus and auto processing that is going to allow you to just run and gun, shoot wherever you are, and just bring this tiny little package. Thank you so much for watching Short Circuit. If you're looking for some more Sony content, check out Brandon's unboxing of the ZV-E10, also an absolutely phenomenal camera for its price.